In today's conversation, panelists will examine how politicians and the press compete for public attention, exploring how the battle for hearts and minds shapes the image of politicians and the coverage that they receive. Panelists will also ask how Americans are affected when they're bombarded with multiple narratives around sociopolitical issues. And finally, our experts will take a closer look at how competing political and institutional media goals can block or reframe information that is shared with the public, ultimately seeking to understand who decides what the public knows and why. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the live chat, and we'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Carlisle Companies. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the American Experience Trust, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now it's my privilege to introduce our panel for this conversation. Yu O Yang is an associate professor of political science at Purdue University Northwest. His research focuses on the American presidency and how presidents leverage their institutional advantages and powers to impact public policies. Jeremy Surrey holds the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is a professor in the university's Department of History and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Dr. Surrey is the author and editor of 11 books on politics and foreign policy, most recently, Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. The conversation will be moderated by Kelly McBride, Senior Vice President at the Poynter Institute for Media Studies. Through her work at the Poynter Institute, she guides the news industry through thorny issues and sticky developments. She also currently serves as NPR's public editor. Thank you again for joining us, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Violet, and welcome, Jeremy and you. It's really great to be here with you today to explore how politicians and the press compete for and shape public consciousness. This conversation is inspired in part by the American Experience films The Movement and the Madman and Citizen Hearst, both of which are streaming right now on the PBS app. So let's get started. For both of you, I'd like to start by asking, the tension between the press and the president is, in the United States at least, is almost guaranteed by the First Amendment, right? It sets up the press as having no regulatory authority over it, and an expectation that the press is going to be critical, if not confrontational, to the president. It doesn't say anything about how the president should relate to the press. And what I'm wondering is if it's unusual for a president to attack the press. So, Jeremy, can you take that first?
Sure. It's a great question. And I think one of the geniuses of our system is the First Amendment and the protection for free speech and a free press. And it has meant since the beginning, since the founding, since the George Washington administration, that presidents have often resented the press and felt they don't have enough leverage over the press. So it was Washington's administration, often Hamilton as the writer for Washington, criticizing the press, and then the Adams administration, the administration to follow Washington, that actually passed laws that allowed for certain press censorship and press repression for the interests of security. The argument was that the French were using the press to drive a wedge between Americans and Great Britain. So this has been an issue there from the beginning. But what I will say is even in these most difficult moments, presidents have generally respected the importance of having a free press. Their disagreement has been with how the press is using its freedom and the perennial presidential perception that the president's point of view is not getting enough attention.
Do you see things any differently?
So I think that's certainly true what Jeremy said in the historical context, right? But in today's political world where the system is marked by hyper-polarization, I think presidents and other elected officials are heavily incentivized to sort of portray the media in a negative fashion, right? In the context that presidents must appeal to particular voter base, right? it's they it is that voter base and that support that they reach out to the public for is contingent on a certain group of the public supporting the president. And when presidents see and then reasons to sort of demonize the media, if you will, to where they portray the media as the opposition, it gives them additional leverage in communicating to voters and other segments of the public that that they're in the correct, that their policy views are correct as opposed to what voters may see in the news.
So can you stick with that for a minute? How do Americans get their information about candidates and issues in elections today? And has that changed over time?
That certainly has, right? So the latest polls would tell us that a considerable majority of Americans today get their news from some sort of digital sources, whether it is websites that they go on actively to look up information or some sort of digital app that they have easy access to on their phone. And the sort of change in technology that Americans have access to news from certainly changed, but what they've also done from the perspective of elected official is it gives them greater access to not only to the population as a whole, but also gives them the ability to target particular populations. So one of the advantages that modern technology has allowed presidents to do is to not necessarily speak to all voter base, but the very voter group that they're seeking out support from.
Yeah, Jeremy, politicians themselves, as well as the press, they're communicating it to the general public, but often to segments of the general public as opposed to the entire general public. So how do these communication messages differ? And yeah, just stick with that. How do these communication messages differ?
Well, so the urge to communicate to different parts of the public and often to communicate with them in different ways has always been there. Abraham Lincoln, for example, wrote letters to newspapers because he wanted to communicate to the readers of Horace Greeley's newspaper or to another one. And then in the age of radio, there was a very conscious effort that Franklin Roosevelt made, not only to do national radio addresses, but at times to speak to local radio stations and other groups like that. So the targeting of specific groups has always been a politician's goal. And of course, you want to spread different messages to different groups, depending on who you're talking to. There's always been a different set of political interests in Michigan than in Florida, for example. What has changed, I think, and I think this is what you was getting at so well, is that digital technology allows a finer micro-targeting, and it allows it to be done much faster. And so now it's not simply defining people by region or the newspaper or a television program that they watch or read. Now you can find, all the people who like chocolate ice cream on Sundays and target them, and explain to them why the other side is going to take away their chocolate ice cream on Sundays. And so that, I think, as a historian, it seems to me it's fragmented our politics because it's made the issues harder to bring together. It's separated them off, and it's created an environment where there isn't one discussion, but there are actually thousands of different discussions going on at the same time.
Well, and it's also created the existence of what a lot of people call filter bubbles, right?
Yes.
So I might only get information about chocolate ice cream on Sundays, or I might only get information targeted to my particular political outlook. How does that affect this whole communication cycle?
So that again is an old problem made worse. If you went to an American city, New York, Chicago, Austin, Texas, in 1920, what you would find are 7, 8, 9 newspapers, kind of like William Randolph Hearst, run by a boss of some kind who has a set of political or economic interests. And people would generally read one or two of those, the ones they agreed with. So people were in information bubbles. Their religious institutions were information bubbles. Their bars or saloons were information bubbles. That's not new. But what's happened now with digital technology is these information bubbles are harder to work your way out of because algorithmically, everything put in front of me, even when I search for something different, reaffirms my bias. So in 1925, I could walk to a different neighborhood in Austin and find my friend there and at least hear what the people are saying in that bar in that neighborhood and what they have in that newspaper that they're reading over there. Today, when I go online and I Google, okay, I want to see what people are thinking, not in Austin, Texas, but in Indiana, where you is, Google is automatically going to give me the things that still reaffirm my bias. And so the algorithmic nature of social media, I think, makes it harder to work out of these bubbles.
Yeah. Who do you think should have, I mean, let's get idealistic here. Who should have more influence over the public? Should it be the politicians or should it be the press?
Well, I think neither, right? I think sometimes in having conversations about who has more power in the political system or who should have more influence or who does, I think we sometimes neglect, forgot that people are at the heart of our political system, right? I mean, at the end of the day, both the elected officials and the media are trying to communicate to essentially the same audience, but from different perspectives, using different methodology and different approaches. In an idealistic way, right? What the people want should take precedent in our political system, but how do we determine what that is, right? Earlier, Jeremy made a very good point about how in today's media and technological context, it may be very hard for individuals to get out of the filter bubbles that they're in. But some research suggests that people don't really want to leave those filter bubbles, right? It's very comforting to have access to individuals who think and feel the same way that I do, right? I think when internet first came on board, right, there was this sort of idealistic hope that now with greater access to information, with greater diversity of views, perhaps we could move closer towards a much more informed electorate. Well, the reality is what technology and internet has allowed us to do is to go even further into the bubbles that make all of us more comfortable. So returning to your initial question, right? Who should have influence? What is it, the elected officials or is it the media? Well, the person that's going to have influence in the polarized world today are the ones that's going to give the voters and the public what they want. The question we should struggle with sometimes, we should think carefully about is sometimes the folks that tends to be the loudest and sometimes receiving the most attention may not be the same voices that should be prominent in a political system.
Yeah. I think it also gets to trust, right? The public has to, news consumers have to be able to trust information that they're getting. And some of them trust some media outlets, some of them trust other media outlets, some of them trust certain politicians, some of them trust other personal forms of information sharing, right? Like if it comes endorsed by somebody in your close network. I want to take a look at this clip from the movement in the MADMAN, where President Nixon tees up his vice president, Spiro Agnew, to change the momentum of a conversation that's happening in the country. So let's look at this clip and then let's talk about what's happening at this moment.
A massive anti-war march with 250,000 to 500,000 people is supposed to come down Pennsylvania Avenue and pass the White House November 15th.
Nixon is going into an offensive mode against the demonstrators, and he knows that on November 15th, there's going to be a mass demonstration led by the new mob.
The positive coverage that had been the case with the moratorium, Nixon doesn't want that to happen again.
So I wrote Nixon a memo and said it's time to attack the media. And I said the Vice President of the United States ought to deliver this speech. And so I wrote that Agnew speech, and there was one editor for that Agnew speech, Richard Milhouse Nixon. And he said, this will tear the scab off those bastards. And we broke out laughing. And it did.
How many marches and demonstrations would we have if the marchers did not know that the ever-faithful TV cameras would be there to record their antics for the next movement.
They get Agnew to give a major speech attacking the media, and they put pressure on the media to run Agnew's speech in its entirety, which they do.
Nixon has his vice president, Spiro Agnew, go on the attack directly against the media. He attacked the elitism of the Eastern elites, the people in Washington and New York. He earlier had called them the nattering nabobs of negativism. Who elected these people to tell you what to think?
The views of a majority of this fraternity do not, and I repeat, not represent the views of America.
It is interesting to note that journalism scholars think this is the beginning of the American people beginning to lose faith in their media.
So, Jeremy, I'm really interested in everything that's going on in that clip because essentially you have the establishments telling the press, don't pay attention to these very loud and these big crowds, right? Don't pay attention to them. They don't represent the rest of the public. Do you really think that that's when the public began to doubt the press or the media as authoritative arbiters of the truth?
Well, it's about that time. I think what also comes up very well in this wonderful documentary is the larger effect of the Vietnam War. Going into the early 1960s, most Americans believed when Dwight Eisenhower or John F. Kennedy or even Lyndon Johnson told them that we were winning a war, or that there were communists infiltrating, or that a set of American military destroyers had been fired on in the Gulf of Tonkin. They believed that. Not everyone, but far more than the majority of Americans believed those things. When the lies were exposed, and it's not the first time leaders had lied, but when the systematic lies around these issues had been exposed, that's really when many Americans began to start doubting their leaders. And of course, when journalists like young Bob Woodward and Seymour Hersh saw an incentive, an opportunity not to be the Walter Lippmanns, who were the journalists who were close to the president and sat in the Oval Office and recounted what they said, but actually to be the gotcha journalists who exposed them. What that clip is about the student movement, the anti-war movement, Nixon's anger about it. Nixon recognized that trust had been lost in the White House to some extent. And now what he was going to try to do is discredit the students as well. So he was turning the same game on them. So yes, that's the period when we see trust in the media and trust in politicians falling off at the same time. And what this clip shows so well is how they're feeding on each other.
Yeah, it's interesting because they're intertwined, right? Like,
Yes.
as a member of the media, I take pride in challenging authority, and it's just so interesting to me that the public started to lose trust in the press because they were losing trust in authority. It's almost like they see the press as one and the same with the authority instead of that dynamic tension in between the two.
Well, and one of the, if I could just say, one of the accomplishments of the press coming out of World War II was, unlike in the pre-war period, many of the leading press institutions, radio, newspaper, and eventually television, they became trusted because they were close to power. We refer to this moment as a moment when all Americans had a consensus and there was some basic standard of opinion in the press. That was a unique moment, and it wasn't necessarily good, because that's part of what got us into Vietnam. No one in 1950 wanted to question what seemed to be an agreement between the Walter Lippmanns and other major press figures and major political figures. That was the exception, though, those 20 to 30 years.
That's interesting because we keep trying to go back to that as like the standard when it really was this very short period in time. Vice President Agnew's speech was broadcast on television. It was quoted extensively. In fact, some newspapers, I think, ran the whole thing. Others quoted extensively from it. What does this say about traditional media's ability to defend itself against attacks? Because journalists aren't really known for explaining what journalism is, or how it exists, or why it exists?
I mean, it certainly puts the media on a defensive position, if you will, right? Um, you know, elected presidents and the media have this mutually beneficial relationship at times, but throughout American history, it's also been a contentious relationship, right? We talk about the sort of declining level of trust in the media. We talked about sort of presidents and elected officials are incentivized to attacking the media at certain times for various political purposes. Um, but what's the media to do, right? They're sort of torn between their obligations to report what is happening on this day in politics. So are they to report on instances like former Vice President Agnew sort of attacking the media, taking this sort of not, I wouldn't say unprecedented, but a different take on criticism of the media, which historically tends to be a lot more private, but now it's certainly in the public eye.
Vice President Agnew described the media as elite, and that he's not the first or the only person to do that. And in fact, I think that has been at times a legitimate criticism of the media. And one of the things that the internet did for the media is force a diversification of voices and perspectives that I think was ultimately good for. I think that was ultimately good for democracy and for press freedoms, although it has made things much noisier and louder and more confusing also. So it's interesting that Agnew, who also was an elite, honed in on this very real criticism of the media, which is that they were elite at the time. They were mostly East Coast, and they were dominated by people who came out of Ivy League schools. You didn't find a lot of Midwesterners, and you didn't find a lot of people who came into the profession not from an elite college organization. Do you see the media as still elite now? Either of you? Both of you? I guess I'd love for both of you to answer that. Jeremy, why don't you go first?
Well, there's certain elements of the media that are elite. The New York Times, which remains our paper of record for those who still read a paper of record, but they actually have more readers than they've ever had. I think they have 11 million subscribers now. They hire our best students, and I'm glad they do. So there is a certain elitism, but that's true in any part of society. Have you noticed who's on the Supreme Court? Have you noticed who the CEOs are in our country, right? If anything, for economic reasons that I think go well beyond our discussion here, over the last 20 years, our society has become more and more unequal, and education has become one of the sorting mechanisms where people reproduce wealth and reproduce access. And I'm not so sure if we went through the internet and looked at some of the most read publications on the internet, that we wouldn't find many of the same things. For better or for worse, elite education provides access to networks and credibility and capital in our society. And I've often found it curious that we single out the media and that we blame the media for that. I see that more as a product of our society. If we want more representation in the media and more representation in CEO suites, maybe we should work on providing more educational access to people.
Yeah. What do you think? Is elitism still a problem in today's media?
A problem? No. In this matter, I agree with Jeremy in that it's largely a function of what our society prioritizes in terms of education and what we look for in potential employees, let's say. But at the same time, it's ammunition, right? It's ammunition for political leaders to sort of sensationalize a big bad media out to get them, right? It symbolizes many Americans' feeling of neglect, feeling of that I don't have a politician who understands my context, my background, my circumstances, and it opens the door to very charismatic leaders it opens the door to media outlets that prioritizes sensational reporting of the news, and all of that contributes to declining trust, right? When, as you mentioned earlier, that this sort of opening of greater access to media companies and news sources to enter the space, it benefited us because it gave us this diversity of viewpoints and types of reportings, but at the same time, it's a lot of noise. And what that noise sometimes do is it really harms our ability to figure out what is actually news and what is very sensational reporting that may not quite rise to the level of news that we should know, but happens to be news that captures our attention and that happens to be on our TV screen right now.
Yeah, and both of these documentaries explore this moment in media that sort of came as an innovation in media, right? So you have William Randolph Hearst. You have his innovation being that he made media more interesting and more affordable for the common person, right? The penny press is what he created, and he claimed to be an advocate for the common man, right? Like he really articulated an advocacy for like the regular guy. Now it turns out that's not at all what he was, right? That he was really advocating for his own interests, and we saw that later. But then you see in the other documentary, The Movement and the Madman, you see that's the moment right after television has become a dominant form of delivery of news. And, they talk about the cameras being pointed. They weren't talking really about still cameras. They were talking about television cameras. And they were saying that was altering the conversation. And we're in this moment now that is the aftermath of the internet, right? And that has created this really, really noisy place. So how do innovations in journalism or in media change the culture of our politics? Jeremy, why don't you take that first?
So it's a great question, and I was thinking as you were speaking, Kelly, of when I go anywhere now, all people are doing is taking selfies, right? Everything is posed for the selfie, right? I'm not even sure they're looking at the monument. They're in Rome and they're looking at their camera rather than the Colosseum behind them, right? I mean, it's extraordinary how the technology changes the way we interact with the environment around us. I think that many of us as historians would argue, I would certainly argue, that most new technologies initially are more divisive. And then over time, innovative users find ways to turn these divisive technologies into technologies that bring us together. Why is that? And Hearst is such a great example. Any new technology, any new innovation, it's easiest to associate it with hate and division. That comes so natural, right? Anything I want to do, I can get attention by saying someone else is bad. There's some bad person out there playing. This is what, of course, the Roman and Greek theorists were writing about centuries ago, playing to the innate insecurities of a large mass of people. It's then a second generation of users who often turn the technology, find a way to use it to bring people together. So I think of Father Coughlin on the radio, some of the most racist, divisive radio programs with some of the largest listenership. And then how Franklin Roosevelt was able to develop the fireside chat as an alternative to that. I think of Joseph McCarthy using televised hearings to embarrass people with false claims that they were associated with communists, and this became entertainment television. And then John F. Kennedy turning television into a medium that actually empowered the president to bring people together, and Ronald Reagan perhaps taking that to another level. I think with the internet, we're still in the McCarthy, Father Coughlin moment. And in one of our classrooms, you and I have students in our classrooms. One of them, she's going to figure this out. She's going to use the internet to find a way to bring us back together. But it takes time, right? Because it's so much easier to divide than it is to unite.
Yeah, what's your take on that?
I want to be optimistic like Jeremy, but I guess I'm not sure if I'm that optimistic. that's certainly the hope, right? Is that someone much more creative than us, much more smarter than us, will figure out a way to leverage the technology we have now, or even the technology we might have 10, 15, 20 years down the road, to find us a way out of the polarized world that we're in right now. Now, where does that take us? Is it going to be, like Jeremy said, right? Is it going to be sort of we're continually be incentivized to going down the path of polarization where, it's much easier to get viewership, much easier to get followers because because people gravitate towards more dramatic reporting, more drama, as opposed to sort of very boring type of context. So what comes to mind in the political context are U.S. Supreme Court hearings or hearings for U.S. Supreme Court nominees. Prior to us putting a television in there and giving the public what senators do in the hearing room, most of the senators do not even show up for these committee hearings, right? Now one would think that, having the opportunity to chat with what potentially is the next Supreme Court justice is a very important thing that senators should take seriously. But the reality is most of them, prior to a TV camera, saw it as something that maybe not quite beneath them, but at least worth less of their time. But when the television camera gets put in that committee room, when there's now an opportunity to show to their constituents and to Americans, an opportunity to ask questions, questions that might catch nominees in a bad position, especially if the senator is of the opposition party, then those committee hearings turn into showmanship, right? It becomes less about finding out from the nominees how they may react as Supreme Court justices, but becomes some sort of political theater.
Right. It's all become so performative. That's actually really discouraging in a lot of our public discourse, right? Like even the debates. It's just standard operating procedure now where a journalist or a debate moderator asks a question and the candidate doesn't even answer that question, right? They go to a completely different message and they are just on message all the time. And it is this performative nature in the congressional hearings that makes you wonder how we can ever model a civil or productive dialogue when our political conversations have become nothing but, as you say, theater. William Randolph Hearst took credit for getting FDR elected, right? Like he really believed that his endorsement and his coverage of FDR got him elected. And then he felt really betrayed when FDR's policies and the New Deal turned out to involve much more government spending than what he, as a conservative businessman, thought was reasonable. So I want to take a look at this clip about how Hearst replied to the New Deal, and then let's talk about what the modern parallels are.
Hearst felt that he had been instrumental in getting FDR into the White House. Now he turned on the president with a vengeance. The chief insisted that his editors call the New Deal the Raw Deal, and wrote that NRA stood for No Recovery Allowed.
From the outset of the New Deal, the Hearst press, the business community in general, are willing to perhaps work with the Roosevelt administration. They're afraid that if somebody doesn't do something to ameliorate the suffering, there really is going to be a revolution. There are people talking that way. And so the business community would love nothing better than for Roosevelt to take a moderate approach in a way that saves capitalism in America. But once Roosevelt's policies had helped to transform the public sense of despair and hopelessness. Then not only does Hearst deride the New Deal as communistic, he refers to the president as Stalin Delano Roosevelt.
Working class Americans loved Franklin Roosevelt. They loved the New Deal. Somebody was finally speaking their language. The fatal flaw of William Randolph Hearst, like many wealthy capitalists who see themselves as able to change the nation, is that they could not imagine anyone acting against them. That their interests were paramount, and so if somebody acted against their interests, they must be an enemy.
Hearst's founding political ideology and myth, if you will, was that he was speaking up for the average American, the working man. In his early career especially, I think that Hearst genuinely seized upon that. Yes, it was convenient, it was pragmatic for him to do that for growing the circulation of his Democratic papers, but he also believed it. Interestingly, as time went on, it was never that deeply rooted in him. At a certain point, some of it, you have to say, is that he began to kind of act like his class. He didn't live and breathe the needs of the people, but he knew how to market to them and sell to them really well. And so I think that that's the key difference, that when the chips were down and when actions and policies were being proposed that actually were helping millions and millions of working men and women across the country, he was unable ideologically to make that shift. A lot of his actions and his behaviors later in his life, he was classically defending his prerogatives as a very wealthy person.
So we really see how media power can influence and control public opinion in this case. You, in the age of social media, where news is now spread out among thousands of sources, do individual media owners have that type of influence anymore?
Well, it's hard to make the case for me to say that anyone has that level of power, right? Let's leave aside media owners for a brief second and talk about elected officials or presidents, right? Presidents are incentivized to talk a lot to the public about their policies, a legislation that is currently underway in Congress. And presidents have always been incentivized. And for the most part, we often make this assumption that when presidents focus a lot of attention on a given issue or a given bill, that there should be some sort of impact, perhaps even to the degree that they may get the public to come back on board, right? Or at least that's the hope when presidents speak publicly. But systematic evidence that shows that presidents can influence public opinion are actually fairly weak and not all that consistent. But one thing that presidents and similarly media owners can do is to influence how much we get, right? How much of certain types of reporting that we get, and what and the sort of the tone of those reporting, and what that's going to allow us to. That's going to allow presidents and media owners to do is not necessarily reach segments of the people that may be open to persuasion or something like that, but instead really grab the people who may be predisposed to think that way, right? So from a elections context, this is less about switching someone's vote from, say, voting for the Democratic candidate to a Republican candidate, but instead mobilizing on the Democratic side potential Democratic candidate who may otherwise stay home, and similarly for the Republican side. So I think overall this is about affecting how much of what someone may already be predisposed to see.
Interesting. Jeremy, I think back to the mid-2000s when the press was really trying to ignore questions because they felt like they'd already answered them about then President Obama's birth certificate status. And yet there were forces that were sort of adjacent to the press. So you had like the mainstream press, and then you had like talk radio, and you had some other personalities. And it was the forces that were adjacent to the press that really kept pressing that conversation and forcing the mainstream media to keep reopening and asking and answering that question. So are things different now than they were? And is it even different than how you is describing?
Well, I mean, I think you make some very good points, but I have a slightly different perspective, and I think it runs parallel. I think we are living in an age of William Randolph Hearsts. One of them is Rupert Murdoch. Another one is potentially Mark Zuckerberg. I think Elon Musk longs for that role. He has not been able to play it yet, but why else would he purchase Twitter? That he's seeking to do that, and I understand that urge. If you have enough money, why not try to develop the largest megaphone on the planet for your point of view? I mean, every professor would love that if we could make our voices heard by all of our students. So I think we are living in a time, because of the inequalities in our society, where, like in Hearst's time, which was also another Gilded Age, right? Those with the resources have the urge to try to flood the airwaves, literally and figuratively, with their points of view. And to your terrific question, the birther stuff around Barack Obama was promoted by Rupert Murdoch, and Donald Trump was promoted by him because it was an alternative to the mainstream press. And Murdoch, as a good businessman, understood, just as Hearst did, that if you play a different tune entirely, you can appeal to an entirely different audience. So they created news where there wasn't news. Let's be clear, the birther stuff never had any fact basis to it. It was not a news item. It should not have been covered, but it was promoted by Fox News and by other things that had common ownership to Rupert Murdoch and others. And that's happening today as well. I don't think that's new. It's not new to this time. It was happening on a different scale with Hearst. That's why the documentary is so valuable to see that. I think this is why people need to be educated, as we're trying to do here, to be critical readers of the press, to understand what they have in front of them, and to understand the different sources and the difference between, quite frankly, a reporter for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal and a tabloid reporter. There's a difference there, and people reading need to know that.
Yeah. We're going to turn to some questions from the audience. We've got a lot of really good ones. And so I'm going to jump around here. But one of the questions that I actually have a take on, but I want to hear what you guys have a take on first, is what is, or how relevant is, the role of the White House press secretary?
So it's a relatively new office. It did not exist really until the mid-20th century, and presidents were not expected to give press conferences nor to have press answers on a daily basis as they do. It's really with the creation of the imperial presidency, with Roosevelt's presidency, that you begin to see this. And I think press secretaries do have a role in agenda setting the discussion among the press. They don't determine the questions, and they generally have a pretty wide funnel for who they allow into the press area. You would understand this better than I would, Kelly. But in choosing to answer certain questions and not answer others, they also create news.
Yeah. Do you have a take on that?
So I think, press secretaries, they're spokespeople on behalf of the White House, right? So it is their job to portray the White House and White House policies in the most favorable light possible, and as well as to respond to the press when there may be something that may be detrimental to the president's policy agenda. That being said, there's only so much that the press secretary, as well as the press office, could do in sort of to limit what reporters may report. They could try to influence it, and certainly they try to cultivate that relationship to where, if there is something in the pipeline that the press that will impact the White House, they will do their best to sort of find that reporter and find ways to sort of make the damage. Reduce the damage as much as possible. But that's also contention on reporters sort of really emphasizing their job as sort of the public observer, keeping the White House in check. And that sort of role sort of ebb and flow depending on who's in the White House and how combative the media may want to be.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that press secretaries, first of all, they get to pick who asks the questions, right? And a lot of times they will spend most of their allotted time on favorable questions, right? And they know how to do that. The other thing is that press secretaries, they act the way the president wants them to act, right? And so if you see a press secretary who's being really demonstrative and argumentative and creating a bunch of clips that are getting shared widely, that's because that's what the president wants that person to be doing, and probably to distract from other types of coverage, right? So when the press secretary is drawing a lot of attention to herself or himself, it's because the president doesn't want the audience, members of the public, looking at other stories that are out there about the president. And then finally, I think the last thing is that in the White House press room, sometimes reporters can do the same thing that senators do, which is they get a little bit performative with their questions, and they try and make it about how smart they are rather than actually getting answers that the public needs to specific issues. And so I do think that the press secretary can be influential, but it's only to the extent that the president wants that press secretary to be influential. Okay, so here's another really good question. How do we increase the participation of young people while getting them to understand that each media source has particular biases? So why don't you take that one first, and then Jeremy, I'll have you take a stab at it.
Well, there's two parts in it, right? How to increase youth participation in politics generally, and how to help not just younger people, but all Americans, all members of the public, to sort of evaluate and consume news from a variety of sources. One experience that I have, I don't know if Jeremy shares this. One experience that I have in talking to a lot of students is that they often feel a certain amount of skepticism and cynicism towards our political system, in terms of, one, they may not be very sure on what exactly their roles are in politics, and how they might go about influencing, right? Because they often hear things either from family members or from the news even, that the public is trying to have this massive protest about an important issue, and that doesn't seem to get anywhere. So for me, it's important for me in the classroom to talk to students and sort of help them understand that our political system is designed to move very slowly on most things, right? So even the most minor of policy initiatives could take very long time to actually go from the idea forming to it actually becoming a law. So getting them to understand the slowness of our political system is key for me. On the sort of consuming the news part, I run an exercise for my students, sort of exposing them to a similar story, but from very divergent news sources. And we will have this exercise on, if you responded favorably to this particular story, can you identify what components of that story that is really speaking to you? And if you're reacting very negatively, why, right? Is this an emotional reaction to some stimulus that you observe in the news story, or is it something else? And we will walk through this conversation. At the end of the day, right, it's very important for all of us to understand that we all come into any situation with a certain amount of biases or stereotypes. It's less about identifying whether something is biased or not, but more important to recognize why we are reacting, and to understand that how our biases may influence how we look at the world.
Jeremy?
I think it's a great question and a great answer from you. I think young people will engage more if people write about the things they care about, not in a condescending way, but in a way that connects with them. And that is also how they will learn media criticism, because they will see different accounts of the same thing. We have missed the ball the last few months, I'm sorry to say, and it's because of all the other things going on. But the protests, no matter where you stand, the protests on our campuses about the Middle East have been undercovered. There has not been enough really good reporting going and talking to pro-Israeli demonstrators, pro-Palestinian demonstrators, explaining the dynamics on the ground, which are much more complicated than what you're generally seeing or hearing. And I would tell you that lots of students were participating, and lots of them would read about that if more were written about that by serious journalists. And I just want to put a plug in for college newspapers, high school newspapers. They tend to be underfunded. They tend to be the last thing that a university president or a principal wants to support, because sometimes they're critical of them. But if we want young people to engage with the media, let's invest in it in the institutions where they're being educated.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, you go even further down into high school journalism, which has been stripped in many cases of all of its resources in many high schools. So here's another question from a member of the public. Is it inherently undemocratic or un-American even for a president to attack the press, like to attack the idea of the press? Jeremy, why don't you take it first?
Yes, that's an easy one to answer. As I said, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Lincoln at times, our great presidents always expressed frustration with the press. FDR, Reagan, they've always been moments they've objected to certain reporters. They've not liked the way they're covered on certain issues. You can imagine Ronald Reagan was not happy with the coverage of Iran-Contra and things of that sort. But I have never, until Donald Trump, seen an elected president who actually said that the press is the enemy of the people. That crosses a line. He didn't say certain reporters, a certain organization. He said the press, and he actually at his rallies often encouraged people to condemn the press. He used violent language toward them. All I want to say, I don't want to judge that. I'm just a historian. I'm a humble historian. That's unprecedented. That should not be happening. Other presidents had never done that.
You?
Also, yes, for me, right? And building on what Jeremy just said, right? It's important for us to point out that this, even though we're using Donald Trump as an example, as we should, right? This is not about an attack on Donald Trump or the Republican Party writ large, right? This is about breaking a precedent, right? When presidents or when serious presidential candidates demonize an entire political institution, it really starts a conversation and harms the overall trust that people have on our political system, which is weakening already as it is, right? I think had it been a Democratic candidate to say something similar, we'll be having this very similar conversation, right? So this is not about a criticism of one particular partisan side, but about sort of this systematic attack on the system itself.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, especially in this day and age, when we have so much press, right? We don't have just 3 television stations and a handful of large newspapers. We have so many press outlets to disparage the entire profession and try and turn consumers against the entire profession. I think is something that it goes against the values that are stated in the Constitution and in the First Amendment in particular, which is the press plays an important role. It's the only profession mentioned in the Constitution. All right, we have one more question from the audience, and I want to ask you both to take a stab at this. I'll ask you to go first. We are in a very adversarial political landscape right now. Are there examples of constructive conversations that you can see playing out in the media? Where do you see people not descending into polarization, but having constructive conversations that actually help advance democratic ideas?
That's a great question. I think it starts with us actually listening. I think in most discourse, whether we talk about something that's politically contentious or even family matters, right? Our immediate reaction sometimes is to go on the attack, right? Especially when we hear something that we either disagree strongly with or we think is utter nonsense. I think in these moments, it's important for us to sort of not react as we may, sort of not speak whatever it comes immediately to mind, but really to stay quiet and allow the person we're speaking to sort of to finish their thoughts and to ask follow-up questions, right? Ask them, why is it that you think this way? What is it really speaking for you, right? To actually understand their perspectives. And I think that from when we do that, we may not come to any sort of conclusion that we agree with, right? But at least we begin the conversation of understanding why people believe or hold certain views that are very different from us. And I think that's very important. It starts that path to a more understanding public that accepts divergent views, but we could still work with each other.
Thank you. Jeremy?
So I think there's a lot of good stuff happening out there. There's a lot of bad stuff, obviously, and the question is spot on with that. But there are a lot of good examples out there. We're just not paying enough attention and amplifying them enough. And so I'll give two examples. They're both autobiographical, and I apologize for that, but I'm talking about what I know. So as I referred to before, I think there's a lot of good student journalism out there. My son writes for the Yale Daily News. A lot of my students write for the Daily Texan here. And these newspapers, they're not perfect, and they're young journalists. They're making mistakes. Kelly, you would take out your red pen, I'm sure. But you know what? They're actually trying to do the job. They're trying to cover these things, and they are self-conscious. And this is a good thing. They're self-conscious of the challenges, and they're self-conscious of not only reporting from one side. I'm not saying they get it right, but they are trying. And we should give more attention to that. I'm proud of students. I think they're often doing better than the older journalists out there. And then the second example I'll give is the world of podcasts, which I've only moved into in the last 3-4 years. I have my own podcast, This is Democracy, which I think is a good example, but there are many others that I'm trying to copy, where you have long-form discussion. What we do on my podcast, which many others do, is we bring on people with different points of view. We don't have a debate. We actually try to understand. So we had former Republican Congressman Will Hurd on our podcast, but then we also have people on the left. We had Samantha Power on our podcast, and we try to talk in 15, 20, 30-minute intervals. We try to understand the issue and understand a point of view. And I'm impressed with the number of particularly young people who listen to podcasts now when they work out, when they're in the car, and are hearing things that are other than just their own point of view echoed back to them. I don't know where that goes. The podcast is different from the newspaper, but I am impressed, particularly for young people, with how they are moving into these spaces where there are real conversations.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us. This has been an incredibly timely conversation, and I know I've learned a lot. I'm going to pass it back to Violet for some closing remarks.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation exploring how politicians and the press compete for and shape public consciousness. Both The Movement and the Madman and Citizen Hearst are available to stream now on the PBS app. You can watch our past forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations, opportunities to watch new films live with us, and more. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great evening.